Well, I think our takeaway from the budget forecast is that elections have consequences. And when Minnesotans switched control of the legislature to 100% Republican control, we went from a $1.6 billion surplus to a $188 million deficit in a little bit less than a year. So elections have consequences, and hopefully people will keep that in mind as we move towards 2018.
Well, I've been sounding a cautionary note for a while, going back to 2014, actually, when Governor Dayton wanted a federal conformity bill passed on tax policy, and we had just balanced the budget in the 2013 session after managing, but for 1 year, a decade of deficits. Having lived through that, I think Senator Cohen will reinforce that we're pretty sensitive about structural balance in the budget and are always concerned about things on the spending side or the tax side. So going back as far as 14, when we finally got it balanced, we did a tax bill in that conformity bill. It was probably too big that year. But Senator Scoy and I actually added a provision that made it more palatable for us, and that was the provision that's in law that says 1/3 of any surplus in November has to go to the budget reserve. I think we're still pretty proud of that provision. The bond houses talk about it. It is the money that's going to be there for us when we have the next economic downturn, and there will be one. I pretty strongly advised the governor the last night of the special session not to sign the tax bill because it wasn't sustainable. I guess I'm not happy about the fact that I was right. But you know, that $188 million doesn't include the funding for the legislature, so the number is actually up over $300 million. And I really hope we can find a way in this session to fix the problem not only in this biennium but in the next one, because I do think we have an obligation to the next legislature that comes in here after the 18 election and the next governor to hand them a balanced budget. You know, Governor Dayton didn't get that when he came in 2010. He inherited a mess. So I am absolutely willing to work bipartisanly to make sure that we can resolve this so that we hand off to the next governor and the next legislature after the 18 election a balanced budget so that they can put the next budget together based on what their more recent priorities are of the public.
You know, there's one thing that I would like to add. I refer to the November forecast historically as a benchmark. And this year in particular, that's important to keep in mind because the February forecast is going to be absolutely key. We have a whole lot of uncertainty with what's going on in Washington. The tax bill that they've now got in conference committee, and if that's resolved before the February forecast, we'll have a better understanding of where we will stand long term in the state of Minnesota. Most of you have written about or read about what some of those tax changes mean for a state like Minnesota and the impact on middle class taxpayers. And so that will also impact on the state budget depending on what comes out of that conference committee and what they ultimately pass.
I will resist, but probably not very well, saying I told you so. This is exactly what we spoke about at the end of the session. This is some of what we spoke about during the session. It's what I spoke about and wrote about during the summer. When you don't pay any attention to the greater context of the budget forecast, when you simply look at the number and see that number and don't pay attention to what's within that number, what it means in terms of the future economy, what it means in terms of the present economy, this is exactly what happens. And despite the disappointment relative to the number for the remainder of this biennium, when you look at the number for the next biennium and keep in mind that the budget that was passed this year was built upon significant parts of one-time money, that will only exacerbate where things are the next time around in a year and a half. And we talked about this during the session, that this budget was being put together in a haphazard way that didn't take into account the state's economy and where it was going, the fact that this is, I believe, the 9th year of economic expansion, the longest economic expansion in post-war. And when you take a look at those kinds of things, you're just simply not going to be able to maintain spending at the level that this legislature passed. And I realize that sounds a little bit counterintuitive to suggest that the Democrats might be more conservative relative to spending. But we certainly would not have used the budget reserve as a slush fund. We would not have used one-time money as was the case. And we would have looked at the context of the budget forecast in a more realistic way. And we would have also not left only $130 million on the bottom line for the next biennium. That was something absolutely calling for a budget deficit. And keep in mind, the budget deficit for the next biennium is significantly beyond that $130 million that was left on the bottom line. You could see that coming. It wouldn't have taken a genius to suggest that that's where we would have ended up today. I hope this next year's session will be able to work through some of this and again put together a budget that will be more sustainable. The governor wanted to veto the tax bill for being fiscally unsustainable. He was absolutely right. It was unsustainable. Many other parts of the budget were fiscally unsustainable, and that's where we are today.
Can you say definitively that it was the budget the legislature passed last year, not broader economic trends? I mean, is it fair to just say this is the Republican legislature's budget that caused these projected deficits?
Well, unemployment continues to go down. GDP growth has slipped some, but not significantly. My concern always was, and I think the concern of Senator Cohen was, this 2% GDP growth that we've got, it's not going to hold. And these numbers are going to get much worse down the road when the economy starts to slow down. And it will. We don't know this federal tax bill, all the things that are in it, and I know there's people that are cheering about it for the business community. But, you know, the only thing we're really seeing so far relative to the business community is the statutory rate reduction, 35% to 20%. What else lies in that? Because most businesses, especially large businesses, don't pay a rate anywhere near to that. They have an effective tax rate that's built off of deductions and credits, just like they don't pay Minnesota's over 9% rate. Most larger businesses pay something in the rate of about 3%. So I think there's a huge question whether the economy is going to benefit from that tax bill, because I think we just don't know enough about what lies under just all the rate changes that are in it. So I think pinning your hopes to something that, and I certainly hope we see some economic expansion with it. I think it's more likely we'll see some inflationary increases from it because, you know, if you're at full employment, it's going to be pretty hard for people to add jobs. But I don't know enough about it yet to have a good opinion whether it's going to help or hurt Minnesota's budget. I know for the most part in this room, we've tried to be in conformity with federal tax changes that are made, and we're not in all areas, but there is no way that the state has the resources to get into federal conformity with this bill from the preliminary estimate that I saw. So we are going to deviate widely from where the federal government is at if the preliminary numbers I've seen about what conformity is going to cost happens, and the certified public accountants are going to go crazy because it'll be a real windfall for their industry as you try to figure out how you add things back, because we work off your federal adjusted income, how we add things back when you do your Minnesota returns. So there's some real problems, I think, on the horizon that the federal government is handing off to the states. And it's not just in the area of tax policy, although that is the thing kind of on the front burner today.
The governor suggested that this will require modest corrections if the track stays on the same way into February. You seem to be talking about a bigger repair job.
Well, I'm looking further down the road. I'm looking past this current biennium that we're in. I still plan to be here and help play some role in crafting a budget for the next biennium. And I don't want to be managing a deficit. There are things that we're going to want to invest in bipartisanly, Republicans and Democrats. And I went through a period of time, you know, during the plenty years where we went from deficit to deficit to deficit, and we couldn't even spend money the Democrats and Republicans agreed we should spend money on. And the perfect example was early childhood. When I came to the legislature, there was no committee, there was no funding. And, you know, we learned early in those plenty years that early childhood spending was a good investment with paid huge returns. But for a decade, we knew it, but we had no money to respond to it. So I don't want to see the next legislature or the legislature after I'm gone be in a position where they can't respond to what they know, everyone knows are good investments. And when you are managing from crisis to crisis to crisis, which is what we did during the plenty era, you can't make good decisions for the future of the state. So my view is a little bit longer. You know, the governor is, I guess it's not going to be his problem. He's not going to be here, but I do plan on being here and do care that the next budget is one that serves Minnesota well.
The governor did not blame the legislature. He said the legislature and I probably spent too much, essentially. That's a summary. And people up there are pointing and saying this is the product of a Republican legislature. That's different than what the governor said.
I didn't vote for all the bills. The governor signed them all. So maybe he's got more ownership in them than I do, I guess. But, you know, I was pretty clear that end of session, and most of you were there that last night. And there's a lot of good things in the tax bill that we passed last year. In fact, there's probably nothing in there that I didn't support. But you can't always get everything you want because there just aren't enough resources for it. And so I'm not critical of the tax committee for the bill that they put together. A lot of good provisions in there, but just a little bit too big, a little bit more than we could afford. I mean, a lot of people would like to have put more money into early childhood or more money into K-12. I would like to put more money into higher ed, but we just didn't have the resources to deliver on everybody's wants and needs. And that's one of the challenges of especially being in leadership when you have some money, when you have a surplus. And it's a neat thing about this state is people come here when you have some money, and guess what? Everybody's thing is the most important. And everybody wants a piece of the pie, and it's very hard for legislators to not overcommit. And that's just kind of what happened in the current biennium we're in here, is I think we overcommitted on the spending side. Maybe we spent too much in some of the budget bills also, in addition to the tax bill, but we overcommitted. And now, and historically, the only difference between the November forecast and the February one is the holiday shopping season. And that is kind of the correction that they make. How did the holiday shopping season come in compared to what they were forecasting in November it was going to? And that's kind of the only factor. So it normally doesn't change much. This year might be a little different. Once we learn more about the potential implications of the tax bill, maybe it'll have more impact on the February numbers than historically they have.
Leader Hortman, too, you sound like you were ready for the campaign and saying Republicans brought you a deficit. Sounds like are you going to use that for fodder to try and take back the legislature?
Well, we're seeing the same thing at the state level that we're seeing at the federal level, which is a massive wealth transfer from the middle class to the super rich. So we have Republicans at the state level and at the federal level cutting taxes for super, super rich people who don't need a tax cut, cutting taxes for corporations, and then leaving the middle class to hold the bag. So whether it's not funding the children's health insurance program and leaving that on the backs of the middle class, or other cuts that they might be looking at, I think that you can see Republican priorities are special interest donors, and Democratic priorities are the middle class. And fiscal responsibility, I would say also.
Senator Bakk, you just came from sexual harassment training, so both you and Leader Hortman, is there enough transparency within the legislature about how sexual harassment is handled and dealt with, and what cases?
Well, let me first say it's very complicated. It's a different kind of work environment. It's a little bit, I kind of liken it, because maybe I'm from the construction industry. It's kind of like the construction industry where you got a general contractor that's managing a project, or a construction manager, and you got all these other people who aren't under your supervision that are in your workplace. And they're here every day, and they're not all just lobbyists. They're all kinds of other people that network around the building. So it's a different kind of work environment. It's hard for us to control things that are really out of our control, but to the extent we can make it a more respectful and a safer workplace for the people under our control, I'm committed to doing that. But I don't know, for example, with people of the press corps or lobbyists that are kind of daily attenders here, how we deal going forward with a reporting mechanism for other people that are interacting in our workplace virtually every day that we have no supervision over. So that, I think, is a larger conversation that, frankly, maybe we ought to involve some representatives of the press corps and some representatives from the lobbying community to make sure that the overall atmosphere of the Senate, much of or the legislature, much of which is out of our control, that we all learn something from the recent events and make the atmosphere better.
Does the public know enough about the accountability when these cases do get brought forward?
Well, I can't remember the last time we had one, so you know, I guess the most recent one in the Senate was the staffer and the majority leader in recent times, and that was a bit of a public process because there was a lawsuit, but you know, I think we're all still, probably trying to digest what all happened and try to be thoughtful in responding. But there is a reason that there isn't the level of transparency maybe that people might like to have, and I've heard the governor talk about it, that, you know, all the legislature's documents and everything they do should be transparent to the public. I would argue some caution on that. I mean, the constituents contact us sometimes with very sensitive issues, things that are happening, and they probably don't want to be called out in the press for contacts maybe that they're making with their legislator trying to resolve a problem. So I think some of the data privacy provisions are important, that if people are going to get the kind of representation they want, their concerns, for them to come forward and have them addressed, I think some level of discretion, I think, is important.
And I would say my biggest hope going into the 2018 session for real bipartisan work is on this issue. Clearly, we have figured out that there's a problem in the atmosphere in the country with regard to sexual harassment. And I think at the legislature, we really have 3 areas we need to look at. One, we need to make sure that members and staff understand the reporting mechanisms that we have and the process and the policies and the procedures in place to protect them. 2, we really have to create a mechanism so that a lobbyist or a member of the press or somebody who's not an employee of the House or the Senate has a forum within which they can make a complaint and get some sort of responsive action without feeling that they're putting their career in jeopardy. And then 3, I think we have to think about the rest of Minnesota. As we look at making our atmosphere more healthy, we have to look at the workplaces in the entire state of Minnesota and say, is there anything about our law that's inadequate to protect people in the workplace today?